Hi, I'm Al Gore's original cat meme from 1988. I am the reason that the internet exists. Kent.
And hello, I'm a Klingon on a bicycle. Tony.
Ooh, perfect. Well, hello and welcome to the Imaginaries Podcast. We are extremely excited this week to welcome one of our all-time favorite authors. And in this case, one of the authors who actually happened to bring the two of us together and kind of planted the seeds that would become this podcast. So today we are welcoming Kim Stanley Robinson. Hello.
Hi Ken. Hi, Tony.
Hello.
So just a quick bio or introduction of Kim Stanley here for you guys who are not familiar. Kim Stanley Robinson is one of the great masters of science fiction, and while hardcore science fiction fantasy buffs will know and love his Red, Blue, Green, Mars trilogy, books like 2312 and Aurora, and his alternate history book, The Years of Rice and Salt, newcomers may recognize his name from its current association with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Message from the Future video, thanks to Naomi Klein. He's written so much and covered such wide material that it's impossible from the outside to pin down what kind of a science fiction or fantasy writer he is. So, Stan, do you see yourself as having like a brand or a specific thing that you do in science fiction or fantasy?
No, I don't. I will put it this way. I do science fiction. I have rarely, and I mean really rarely, ever done what I would call fantasy. And when I've done it, I've tried to tweak it into science fiction in odd ways and critique it. So mainly, I'm a science fiction writer, and I frankly don't like the subcategories that have been chopping it up ever since I got into the field in different ways that are often exclusionary or reductive or pigeonholing or somehow trying to box me in when I don't want to be boxed in. Not just me, but everybody else who gets tagged with these same terms. I'm thinking literary science fiction. Clearly terrible. Hard science fiction. Very hard to figure out what that would really be. And then supposedly there might be soft science fiction. And feminist science fiction, a great thing, but also that's an attempt to box certain people into a corner you can ignore. And it goes on like that right up to the current day. And we'll end up talking about that a lot today, so I'll pause on that.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, we love to deconstruct labels and terms and expressions and categories because we both, I think I speak for you, Tony, on this. We love the impulse to categorize, but we also love to defy categories ourselves. So, reading your work and hearing from you directly that you like to sort of stick to this broader understanding, maybe even deconstructing the word genre a bunch, like that's really affirming. Like we have been reading you correctly, which is
well, it isn't that opaque or coded. My opinions I've stated plainly many a time, and I've had to think about it a lot because I began selling stories in the science fiction field that were clearly science fiction stories. And that's a community as well as a genre. So there's genre, there's community, there's marketing category. These are not quite the same things. And each one of them can be discussed in turn, and they have interrelationships, obviously. And I've gotten really fond of the science fiction community. And I feel that I am inextricably linked to the science fiction genre and to the marketing category. I couldn't get out even if I tried, and I don't want to try. So I have had to think about it quite a lot because it's a mark of Cain. In other words, it's like a big red slash on your forehead that puts you off limits for many a fellow human on this planet that will say to me quite frankly and openly, I never read science fiction. And there's a lot of people like that who I think might like the genre, might like my books, but I can't be bothered to argue with them because they're already set in their ways and knowing in their own mind what they think that they're talking about. So I definitely am interested to talk about it with you guys and have thought about it a lot.
Yeah. So one of the things that fascinates me too is that you have this long history of speaking about science fiction as an authority on science fiction. And also like the sort of crossing over into being an authority on, ecological shifts and changes, and things as current and updated as like the Green New Deal, the current incarnation of the Green New Deal. And I guess I'm curious, like, do you see your history as a writer as being, do you see your main work as being to write the work or to contribute to this larger conversation, or both? Or am I kind of creating a useless binary there?
No, I think it's a good question to ask. It's not, it's a real binary, and I just want to write good novels. This is what I want to do, and the slow and uneven morphing into a public intellectual, to the extent that I am one, it comes completely from my novels. Yeah. I have no institutional affiliation. I have no special area of expertise. I'm just a science fiction writer. And so those novels have gained me a certain standing in the larger sphere of culture, so I am one of the general culture's science fiction writers. And to the extent that there aren't very many of us, and I'm not like any of the rest, then I'm just, Robinson. And that comes from the novels that I've written and people's affection for those novels completely. And I still am just an English major. I have no particular expertise. I'm scientifically literate. I have a good general layperson's scientific education at this point, but nothing specific or particular enough to make me an expert on anything, really, except for novels.
So, thank you. That's beautiful and profound, and I think lays some of the groundwork for where we're going to go today. Tony, did you want to walk us through some of the big questions that we want to kind of tackle over the course of the next hour?
Yeah, so I want to ask some questions about like ecological science fiction more generally, like green science fiction, green fiction, like, because for better or worse, like I feel like that's something that I have seen, that I have read associated with you a lot of the time. So how do you respond to that? How do you see that as kind of like, yes, this is the work that I tend to do. I see this in what I'm doing. Is that something that you don't see? Like, what does that even mean to you to have like ecological or green fiction or science fiction?
Well, good question, and it has to be unpacked. First, I should say that there's really a lot that you all are going to be discussing here that I have not read. And to a certain extent, that is deliberate on my part. Over the last 20 years, I've decided that having dove really deep into science fiction, history of science fiction, and also English and American literature, what's going on contemporaneously, I need not to know so that I can do my own thing without scaring myself by how weird I might be becoming. Like, are my books weird? Well, many people seem to think so. I don't know, because I haven't read anybody else in the contemporary scene very much. That isn't completely true, and I'll make some exceptions later, but I have to start with that. So I hear about eco-fiction. I have no idea what it refers to.
Yeah.
Is it really maybe Barbara Kingsolver and me? And I haven't read Barbara Kingsolver, but my wife has and has told me a lot about it. And then who else are we talking about here? And is it like one novel from one person and one novel from another person? Eco, does that mean that it's about nature, and finally people can write about nature without being accused of doing expository lumps or info dumps? I mean, I would be speculating out of a state of ignorance.
Yeah.
Now, climate fiction is different. I know a little bit more about that, but not much, because, again, I've been dodging contemporary work to a certain extent.
Right.
Green fiction, well, come on, that's just another way of saying eco-fiction, I guess, or saying that the person has green politics. And I think that's what's happened. My impression of the last 5 years or so is this notion of being a green, even though they did great in the European Union elections recently as a political party, it used to be a person that cared more about the environment in a kind of a freakish way that made them maybe anti-humanist and a bad leftist. A Green was some kind of bourgeois, a well-off person that could afford to worry about the environment. Well, this is all at least 30 or 40 years out of date. And in the current, there's all kinds of what I call red-green healing going on, where the planet has obtruded on our attention and has crushed us in the face, and everybody has to pay attention to it. And then also solutions to it are obviously going to be leftist solutions are the only way, because it's going to take government action and not the free market. So you get a green-red healing, and whether you care about the plight of the precariat or you care about the plight of the rainforest, they are the same thing now.
Yeah.
So there's no point. What you want to do is historicize that stuff and say, at this point, we're talking about the whole picture every time we talk about any part of it. And then genre and these micro categories of science fiction or of fiction in general are something that Amazon.com is doing in order, clearly in order to differentiate. If you have a bookstore that has 5 million titles in it, then you don't just say the science fiction section.
Right.
You say the dystopian, green science, fantasy, eco-climate section, with a female protagonist. And that's a genre.
Right.
And so that has already happened, and it's a use value for people who want to choose books that are like the other books that they liked, or they're exploring, and want to get into subject matter that they are particularly interested in. When you've got the infinity of Amazon, then you need that kind of thing. But for discussing it in the larger culture, and even it's a little bit too fine a cut for my purposes.
Yeah. And this might actually play into the next question, but what role has science fiction, especially your science fiction, kind of played in recording what people were thinking, what people were doing, what people were feeling at a given point in time? Do you see that true? Like, does science fiction kind of like play the role of time capsule some of the time?
Oh, always. Yes. And John Clute says that he can take any science fiction text and read it without knowing its date or its author, and tell you the year that it was written in to a very close and sharp degree, partly stylistic and partly content and modality. And so there are changes through the years that every science fiction novel is two things at once. It's a prediction of a future that seems possible from that moment where it was written, and it's also a metaphorical portrayal of that moment that it's written. The metaphors are all science fiction metaphors, but it's clearly decodable as a symbolic portrait of the time that people are in, but also what they thought then was going to be possible in the future. Right. At least sometimes. Other times there's more of a game playing aspect of it, in which case you're just playing the game and not trying to say much about what you think is really happening. And since there's so much science fiction and so many different kinds, there's a kind of a shotgun effect. But every science fiction text will refer back to the year that it was written in pretty nicely, and then it gets historicized. And when you read, say, good science fiction from the 1950s, of which there's a lot, then you're getting a great portrait of the hopes and fears and dreams of the 1950s generation, better than if you were to write just a history of the 50s. So it still has that value, even if its predictions are wrong, or its science fiction devices are clunky or whatever. Clearly happens every time. I mean, people are reading my Mars trilogy now as much as they ever have, which is wonderful for me to see. But the Red Mars is now 25 years old, and so I know that it's shocking to people to see, like, A, early manifestation of YouTube, B, people using videotape or fax machines in order to get their tech around. And so this kind of discrepancy between things that seem right and things that are obviously wrong, that's one of the pleasures of reading older science fiction.
Yeah.
And I mean, technology is always going to be one of those things which can data work. The technology in something like Logan's Run or something like that, it will always kind of, depending on how you frame it, it can data work. But I kind of look at your work and I think of one of the things that Margaret Atwood has said many times, which is that she never writes about technologies and events or behaviors that haven't already happened or been created. Is that something that's true of your work as well? Like when you are writing your science fiction and you're thinking about future technologies, are you drawing specifically on things from the present?
Well, not always, and I think that's absolutely untrue of Atwood as well. She says a lot of things about science fiction that are not true, and why she does that is her mystery to unfold. I'm not interested in psychoanalyzing her, but some of it is offensive, but some of it's just wrong. And the kind of stuff that I hear that she's writing about, and I can't speak for sure because I don't read her. It is biotechnology that's not only impossible now, but it will always be impossible. But this is where you get into the land of metaphor, I presume. In my own case, depending on the story involved, I've tried pretty hard to stick to what seems plausible given what we know now, but within the parameters of the game that I want to play. Mm-hmm. So if I want to, I mean, very often I've had lifetime extension and had people living like 500 years. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not at all sure that that's possible. In Galileo's Dream, I had a time travel story, which I'm flatly sure is impossible, but I wanted to do a time travel story. That, in effect, is a kind of a fantasy that we group with science fiction for, historical reasons having to do with H.G. Wells and the idea that a machine is involved. Right. But a time machine is a fantasy device, and yet it gets stuck in the science fiction genre, and I had a story idea I wanted to use. So, I would maybe more than 50% of the time I'm reading science news, I'm thinking, if this gets even a little bit better, we'll be able to do X. Or I'll read the latest about rocketry or something that gets us around the solar system, or for sure the entire terraforming literature, including the really wild terraforming ideas like Venus or Mercury. And I'll say, gosh, this makes for such a cool story space. I have to write it up as if it's going to happen, even though I have my doubts. Right. And so it's really in pursuit of story after story. And then, given the topic of our subject today, I will say that climate change, global warming, the idea that we're going to have to terraform Earth, which we call geoengineering, that this has become more and more pressing in my face, and it seems like there's multiple stories to tell. So partly after Mars trilogy, there's about similar stuff in Antarctica, and then in the Science in the Capital trilogy, now called Green Earth, and New York 2140, and all up and down the line over these last 20, 25 years, I keep coming back to that topic, and I think trying to take in the very latest of what the sciences are saying about it.
Mm-hmm. And also it seems like, how people are reacting to it. Like, I remember one of the really standout bits for me in Antarctica was kind of that you had eco-terrorism going on. So it's not like, it doesn't feel like you're paying lip service. It feels like you're actively capturing the sciences as they are in the moment, but also capturing people's reactions to them, which seems like a really integral part of science fiction as well.
Yeah, over in Antarctica, I was reading Eco Defense, and I drove up into the California foothills one night in the middle of the night to see what it would be like, kind of a practice run without actually doing anything illegal, but what would it be like? Mm-hmm. And I was super interested in that whole movement, Dave Foreman and that whole crowd, and so was the FBI. Those people got, seriously crushed for messing with property, and it just goes to show that they were trying to preemptively stop something that might have been hard to stop if it had become a bigger social movement. If more people had started to do it, it would have been really hard to stop. And so the people starting it were crushed. Yes, and so as I read, I'm very much responsive to the stuff that I read. I mean, around 2001, the studies of the Greenland ice core showed that the Younger Dryas went from a warming, wet climate to a cold, dry climate in just 3 years. And this blew everybody's mind. And I said, I have to write that because 3 years is the time that a novel can cover. Right. Yeah. And that was where the Science in the Capital idea came from. Mm-hmm. The stalling of the Gulf Stream being the suspected culprit there. Yeah. So yeah, it's a methodology, and it gives me more ideas than I have time to write, and it gives me a kind of a thick texture for the novels that I do write. I can do the kitchen sink principle. Sometimes I've overplayed that kitchen sink principle and really have thrown in the kitchen sink, like everything, so that a novel that has everything in it gets kind of crowded and confused. And I've done that.
Well, sometimes that allows for interesting and unexpected ideas to emerge from, the kitchen sink, so to speak.
Yeah, it's kind of an effect.
Yeah.
It's an aesthetic effect, the everything effect.
Yeah, and you're creating a space in which maybe more playfulness is allowed, and, maybe you didn't originally set out to write one story element, but it appeared as you were going.
Green Earth is very much like that.
And I love that about it. So I've seen some threads already popping up in the conversation that I just want to kind of like tie together a little bit. Like we've been talking about some of the tools that you use to write, some of the various methodologies, but also some of the texture in the background, like the sense of place. You talked about the California desert or the California mountains, and you talked about Antarctica. Like sense of place is very important to your work. At least I hope I'm not just reading that into it. I think it's very important and it's a key integral part. But like, do you see the origins of each story as coming from like this extended thought experiment, which has been revisioned in, say, something like 2312 and something like New York 2140? Or do you see it as something else that's kind of encroaching or encouraging you to start a new tale?
Well, first I want to say that I definitely love writing about the places that my characters are in some detail, because I think it's interesting and fun and can be beautiful. So in an ordinary kind of 1950s workshop, which is still completely powerful in our current workshop aesthetics, we would call that setting, as if it was kind of a decoration or a particular color on a palette, a secondary feature that nevertheless could be included, like with theme or plot or character or style or setting. These are, I no longer trust these workshop terms, but I always thought that was a great thing to include. Well, now if the story's about the landscape, like I would say the Mars novels is where I made that break big time, but even in The Wild Shore. The Wild Shore is about how do you adapt to Southern California when it's suddenly snowing there and you don't have any access to electricity, kind of thing. So an adaptation to a landscape and to a planet, this is a crucial science fiction act. It goes back to all the planetary romances, Jack Vance and J.G. Ballard's Destructo novels. I was in a tradition there within science fiction that was attentive to planets, and Le Guin, with her first 4 Hainish novels, was stupendously good in a way I think that harkened back to Jack Vance and to Edgar Pangborn and the earliest Ballard, that planets were interesting in and of themselves and beautiful characters. They were new, they were exciting. So it's a sort of a romanticism, the sense of landscape as a character, or the pathetic fallacy or whatnot. Science fiction has always had a big strand of that, and I always loved that part of it. And then to the second part of your question, I really just try, one idea seems to trigger another one, and they have often logical connections, or I'm trying to figure out what went wrong in the previous book that I could make better in a current new idea. They bounce off each other in ping-pong fashion, but in several different modalities. So it's a kind of confused and instinctive process. It's by no means a logical progression. I pick what seems like the best idea for a book that I have on hand and do the best idea. And then when I'm done with that one, I look around and see which is the next best idea. Well, sometimes it makes no sense at all. Other times I get, in the last 10 years, I've gotten huge help from my editor, Tim Holman, who helps me to think through it and also helps me to decide which one would be right next for my audience to feel a continuity. Mm-hmm. So that's all been at play the whole time.
And I love that, like, your sense of drive, you're allowing it to be what it is instead of trying to kind of corral your sense of drive or the origin for each story into one particular corner or the other. I love that. That's amazing.
So my question is that despite, like, I feel like even within your works, like if we're just taking your works, there's a really different, or there's certainly a spectrum of how you respond to the environment, how you respond to place, how you respond to terraforming, and you explore these ideas in lots of different ways. But as we were trying to think of, works from the last 5, 10, 20 years, it seems like any work that tackles the environment or ecology or the future of the planet is kind of a little dystopic, or at least it kind of has like a negative, pessimistic take on it for, the immediate future. Do you think that that's true? Do you think that that's warranted? Like what do you think of that?
I think, uniformly portrayed climate change happening, and that's what you're identifying.
Mm-hmm.
I know that, and in the Mars books, it wasn't so much climate change as it was the collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet because of a volcanic eruption underneath it.
Uh-huh.
Because that's a volcanic zone that could happen, but it's just a random thing. If it did happen, then you get a really rapid rise in sea level, and I wanted that for the Mars trilogy as being the only thing I could imagine that would be disruptive enough to allow my Martians to actually succeed in their drive to independence. So this was very instrumental. It was interesting, and I thought it was possible, but it wasn't directly climate change driven. But it ended up having the same effect because it was early description of sea level rise. And of course, Ballard in the Drowned World had already done it, so it wasn't the earliest. And in my short story, Venice Drowned, was years before. But then, starting with Antarctica, I've portrayed a warming world and a world, an Earth in trouble. Because I think that at this point, we can't dodge that trouble. We're already in the start of it. We're going to be coping with it either better or worse. And those are stories to tell that what's the alternative? If you were to write about the Earth going on and climate change weren't included, what would you be doing? I don't know if that strand of science fiction even exists, to tell you the honest, because I don't read much science fiction, not from the present, because like I said, I'm deliberately trying to keep ignorant of what my colleagues are doing.
Mm-hmm.
But if you were to write a novel set in, say, I don't know, the year 2070 and climate change wasn't part of it, then wow, I'm amazed.
Yeah. So it's kind of just like you are a person who is present in the world and you are aware of things and you include the relevant things in your books. It's like, it's not even necessarily, something that it is something that you're very much intentional about, but if you didn't think about climate change in your books, it would be a glaring omission.
Well, it would be if you portrayed a world going forward in which it wasn't a factor, but you were still doing a kind of a realistic science fiction, or what we used to call near future science fiction, when the dividing lines weren't so sharp. Right. The thing is that I love all kinds of science fiction, and you can divide it up by periodization techniques. Yeah. If it's in the next 100 years, that's near future, and oftentimes you wouldn't put a date on it. It's a kind of form of realism of how now feels. Yeah. Then if you had it in the far future, that would be space opera. Right. It's a fantasy space. You often have faster than light travel and other kinds of groovy story helping tricks. Mm-hmm. Because really, once you get 500,000 years into the future, who knows what could happen? So that's a story space opera. And then in between those two is a zone that is less populated, as I've pointed out, say 100 years from now to 400 years from now. That's hard to call, tricky. If you want to play it realistically, then you have to be bold, but you also have to try to be realistic at the same time as being bold. Mm-hmm. It's harder than hell, and I think it's an interesting space. Mm-hmm. That's why I did 2312, and and the Mars trilogy ends up in that space. I keep coming back to that space of what you might call future history. It's not near future science fiction. It's not space opera. It's future history because some history has to have passed. Right. So Often, I think, dealing with climate change is indeed a centuries-long problem, maybe, unless we were to jump on it and become really good at geoengineering.
Yeah.
But by and large, especially because of the heat that's been tucked away in the ocean and ocean acidification, we really are talking about a centuries-long impact that we've already started. So you kind of have to deal with that. But I want to just say that I love all kinds of science fiction. And if I, like in Galileo's Dream, I had an idea for a time travel story that took Galileo to the year 3000. The question was, what had science and religion done in their battle over human history? It wasn't involved with climate change per se at all, because I didn't want to tell that story.
So the quote that I mentioned from you that has now gotten tied to the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez video was a recent discovery of mine, but it was from the Lit Hub article. And you said that the future isn't cast into one inevitable course. On the contrary, we could cause the sixth great mass extinction event in Earth's history, or we could create a prosperous civilization sustainable over the long haul. Either is possible starting from now. And I guess this, for me, brought me straight back to what Tony was asking earlier about like dystopia in respect to like the optimism versus pessimism debate over the future of our planet relating to climate change. Do you really see there as being like a prosperous future? Is that optimism something that you are working into your works, your written works, as well as the potential fear factor that is always going to be there about the future?
Well, yes, I would say, looking back, that's how all my novels have ended, that if you start with a realistic portrayal of the problem as it exists in its full gravity, and then you fight it to make things better as hard as you can. So I write utopian novels. I would say Green Earth, they do their best to restart the Gulf Stream. They do their best to make government and science work together to overcome the forces of the carbon industry. They do their best to take secrecy and deceit out of the election systems, and they're fighting the good fight, and that's in the very near future. Like, really, that's stuck in the Bush years in a way. That's a very strange combination of historical novel and near future science fiction at this point. So there's no novel of mine where you can't find the utopian turn in it, of people doing their best to make a better world. And that's why I would reject the notion of a dystopian novel. I'm not interested in doing those. The closest one I came to, I wrote in 1986 and 87, The Gold Coast. Mm-hmm. If Reagan America had just charged over the Orange County landscape in the way that they wanted to, you would have gotten to the Gold Coast. And in some ways we have. So that's my gesture towards dystopia, but even there, the individual characters are trying to do their best to make things better. Mm-hmm. And then what you need is to move to Pacific Edge, the very next novel, to get to the utopian strand where they've succeeded. And these are not sequels to each other, but just contemporary visions of if we did things right or if we did things wrong, starting from now. Mm-hmm. But it's more interesting to write about doing things right. So this is true of New York 2140, and it's true of people coping with the situation at the end of Aurora. Mm-hmm. It's true in 2312 with the attempt to return the animals, which is a beautiful utopian dream, I feel.
A gorgeous scene, absolutely.
My favorite scene. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
And so, aside from Galileo's Dream, where the fight was more fundamental, do we believe in science or do we believe in superstition? That was a kind of a macro issue. But even in the Years of Rice and Salt, mm-hmm. for instance, I thought in the Years of Rice and Salt I had escaped the problem of utopia versus dystopia. But in fact, if you propose an alternative history as huge as the one in Years of Rice and Salt, like no Europeans alive,
right.
Then you make a future that an alternative history is either better, which would be saying Europeans are evil, which I don't believe, or you make it worse, which is saying that, the other cultures of the world weren't as smart as Europeans, which is clearly wrong. Mm-hmm. Or you show it being identically the same, in which case you've got a completely boring alternative history. So caught in that trilemma, so to speak, with nowhere to go, it occurred to me that what I needed to do was to go past our moment in time. So I needed my story to shoot past 2002, go about 70 years in the future. In that alternative history, in those 70 years, they make utopia. Mm-hmm. And then it becomes a challenge to us. If we were at the same state as the 2002 without any Europeans, more or less, could we do as well as they did in the following 70 years?
And Tony, you had a question about the three Californias.
Yes, I do want to follow up on that, specifically Pacific Edge, because it kind of seems like, the legal structure, the government, there's a word I'm not thinking of, but like the government structure that makes Pacific Edge into what it is kind of similar to the Green New Deal. So I wonder, like, when you see moments like that, this isn't a question about prediction, but kind of like, you've been doing this for a while now. And is it like, when you see something like the Green New Deal come up, and you've written, about some of these utopias that have similar legislation, like at their core, how do you feel? Like, how do you respond to that?
The problems that were obvious when I wrote Pacific Edge, that began around 1980. With the fall of the Soviet Union, it took over the world and became a dominant superpower in the world. The Washington Consensus, the neoliberal order, all of that was already visible and obvious in its ramifications, in its badness to people, to ordinary people, and to the environment. It was obvious then. It didn't take prediction. I was writing about 1988, but 1988 and 2019 are not substantially different in terms of the global world order, right. Alas.
Yeah.
So now that's 30 years lost to environmental destruction and to people's lives being blighted and devastated. There has been progress made, but it's often been made in spite of capitalism or on the margin of capitalism. Right. The U.S. developmental goals, the millennial developmental goals, millions of dollars were spent in a gift economy, not for profit, and hundreds of millions of people were taken out of immiseration by that. What it shows is that the technical apparatus, the human capability and knowledge, and even the capital is there to raise everybody to adequacy, but that's not our project. Mm-hmm. Our project is profit, and the 1% and the top 10% securing their position of privilege by any means possible. Mm-hmm. Many of those people have given up on the project of making everybody on Earth adequate, even though the dangers of that cynicism are really obvious. Yeah. So it's a sort of stupidity at the top. And so I guess along with everything else, I'm kind of frustrated. I wrote Pacific Edge like any utopian does. People will read this. They'll see there's a better way. Well, maybe over time, as part of a larger social movement, the utopian texts are important. I think Ecotopia was important. Mm-hmm. And Pacific Edge is very much a disciple text to Ecotopia. Mm-hmm. And there were many other nonfiction utopian writings in the 70s that I used to make the world of Pacific Edge and the earlier utopias, all the way back to Moore. So you just have to keep on doing it. And so I have to say it was quite beautiful to see the Green New Deal. The actual document itself is really, really good. Mm-hmm. It has a couple things that I wish were there that aren't. And it has a couple things that are there that surprise me with how great it is that they're there, that I wouldn't have expected to be there. Mm-hmm. And I've been telling everybody it's really important to remember that the original New Deal took 12 years and was 5 distinct movements. Mm-hmm. That you can't reify the Green New Deal and say that it's just one thing. It's more a spirit or a project in action that's going to take, a couple of congressional generations at least to get it accomplished, but that it is a survival manual, that we need to do all the things in the Green New Deal. Mm-hmm. So then the question becomes, how do we get the political will? How do we pay for it, et cetera?
Right.
From a pragmatic sense, a lot of the items in the Green New Deal just read as like necessary things that must happen. Like these are critical ingredients to survival. So yeah, it would be interesting to see like what economic underpinnings will come alongside or to kind of support that. One of the things that I find really interesting about your work, Stan, is that they are essentially villainless in the character sense. Very few of your books have characters or a character that could be, cast in such a narrow role. But in a lot of ways, I guess you could say that capitalism is one of the villains in your work. Do you see that as true? Do you see your work as specifically grappling with capitalism as something to be pushed back against? Or do you see it as reaching beyond capitalism, positively looking for something else to build up?
Well, it can be both at once, but it's definitely an anti-capitalist body of text. It's a critique. It shows in books like The Gold Coast and like in Green Earth or at the end of Aurora, the damage that can be done, and 20 through 12 also, the damage that capitalism does by mispricing the natural world and the biosphere, by not valuing these things enough to give them their proper prices and not using them in a sustainably recycling way, so that we essentially take the usufruct of the biosphere and we use and live off of the extra without cutting into what some people call the natural capital, although I hate that. It's really just killing off parts of the biosphere faster than the biosphere can grow back, which is really quite an accomplishment because the biosphere is robust and does grow back fast.
Yeah. But
we're killing it off in increments as if it isn't our body that we rely on. So, yes, an anti-capitalist text. And also, as I've worked on, I've tried to critique it, like, why is it wrong? And how could it be made better? And I have had characters that are, I guess I would say, to the extent that they understand the system, well, what I've tried to do is give every character their own internal self-justification. So if you took any one of my characters and they were put on the stand or they were put before God, why do you do what you do? What do you believe? So this is something that maybe one is always thinking about these days. If you think about a church-going, middle-class person in the United States that voted for Trump and still supports Trump, why do you believe what you believe? Well, this is a question you have to listen to and analyze and hope that if you ever got into a discussion with them, you could argue them out of it. Now, that's really hard. Nobody likes to admit they're wrong, and everybody is so set in their ways right now that it's unlikely that hypothetical discussion ever happens. But a novel kind of stages that. And if it's persuasive enough, then what I would hope is that your hypothetical and somewhat mythical independent voter, who's open-minded to whatever seems most reasonable as an American, given our common high school educations, blah, 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 that they would be convinced to buy the text in ways that aren't too manipulative, but seem to come out of the action of the plot itself, that they seem to make sense. Well, this is all super... And it can easily become heavy-handed. It's a kind of burden to put onto the novel, but I think also it's interesting, and I can't help myself.
Yeah, totally. And I've just maybe what will be a short follow-up question, but we actually came across this, I don't even remember what episode it was, but several episodes ago, where we were trying to think of books, authors, works, series, what have you, that were anti-capitalist or that showed alternatives to capitalism. And the list that we came up with was really short. And I mean, beyond your works, what pops into my mind immediately then as now is The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Guin. So what other anti-capitalist, alternative capitalist books or works do you recommend, have you drawn on, have been, important for you?
Yeah, it doesn't even have to be books, because you've mentioned that you're not reading your contemporaries, so to speak, in science fiction, but are there other conversations happening about this, that you've encountered?
Well, it's often bookish more than conversations, but let's start with Philip K. Dick and Le Guin, and really the whole strand of the new wave science fiction, Samuel R. Delany, Thomas Disch, Joanna Russ.
Yeah.
These are intensely critical of American capitalism, and Phil Dick was part of 1950s leftist turn in science fiction that included Fred Pohl and Damon Knight and Alfred Bester and Walter Miller, and these were John W. Campbell, anti-Golden Age science fiction writers in the 50s that preceded the New Wave, that were really intelligent critiques of capitalism of their time, the 1950s normality. And then that gets me back to a very important precursor that I love, which is John Dos Passos and his USA trilogy.
Yeah.
So this is a monster of American literature that really ought to be the 20th century Moby Dick equivalent. But Dos Passos had a really odd personal story. Then he started as a leftist. He went to the Spanish Civil War. He got disenchanted by the way the communists were killing the anarchists in Spain. And when he got back, he began to become more and more of a right-winger until eventually he was supporting Nixon and J. Edgar Hoover, et cetera, through the 60s. Yeah. So in the 30s, he was ignored because he was a leftist. In the 50s, he was ignored because he was a rightist. He was always on the wrong side.
Yeah.
But the USA trilogy is a powerful indictment of the capitalist machinery and a beautiful novel, a trilogy, a big fatty that if English departments had their 20th century American vision better corrected and weren't completely enchanted still by the glamour of Fitzgerald, Hemingway, Faulkner trio, you would have Dos Passos, you would have Zora Neale Hurston, who's also really good on these issues. 20th century American lit is right now poorly taught because of the glamour of the big three.
Yeah.
And Dos Passos getting left out of the canon when actually reading him would explain the 20s and the 30s in a way better than anything I've ever read about it.
Yeah.
So I don't feel at all isolated. I feel part of a tradition that it makes sense that novelists are going to be critical in their politics of the way things are. You only occasionally get a kind of conventional figure that loves the culture that he's in and yet is still writing about it well. And I'm thinking Balzac comes to mind. I'm sure some others would come to mind if I was quicker witted right now, but there are others, but they aren't that common.
Yeah, I mean, the only one that I was able to think of, I'm remembering the episode you're talking about, Tony. The only one that I was able to think of was Cory Doctorow with Walkaways and a number of other works. And he's offering a very specific.
I love Cory, and I love Cory's writing, and I have read a couple of his novels because of my affection for him personally. And Walkaway is really good, and so is all of his.
One of the things that I enjoyed about Walkaways specifically is that it encouraged me to view, I guess, this whole messy cluster of subgenres we've been talking about, eco-fiction and green fiction and so on and so forth, as melded inextricably with like social science fiction and the exploration of different ways of being together, different ways of living collectively as a whole in the midst of this world. So they were kind of both and instead of either or. And I thought that was an approach that sadly isn't so common yet, but it is something that we're starting to see emerge as sort of those torchbearers of green fiction, so to speak, kind of meet and pass the torch on and pick up other torches themselves relating to this like social experiment that the future, what is the future for us as a people as well as for a planet?
Yeah, I think there's room now for writing about a post-capitalism, and Cory made a gesture that way, and it's hard to imagine, and one goes back to previous forms, the return of the commons and the return of a kind of a system of communal behaviors where you get away from the hardcore American suburban nuclear family and get back to something a little more aligned with almost village level groups, and then those groups grouping together. I often think of Mondragon, Spain, and the co-op movement, and I can see Cory's tapping into the same kind of sources. But I'm also very interested in the global neoliberal order and replacements for that. So, of course, bottom up, that's great. Everybody makes their own, but the danger there is that you get into a pocket utopia. Oh, we've got it great in our valley. The rest of the world can go down the tubes to hell, but we're okay in our valley. Well, your valley won't do okay if the rest of the world goes to hell.
Right.
So the ultimate fix, I often use the motto, there is no pocket utopia. The ultimate fix has to be global, and this is terrifying because it really means agreement across 8 billion people that don't seem to agree about very much. But you can then conceptualize the global village. You can conceptualize all men and women are brothers and sisters, a sense that everybody on the planet alive at the same time is actually part of a shared fate because of the way things work now, and that there might be diversity within some overarching fairness. And this is the post-capitalist dream. Now, why aren't there more? It's hard to conceptualize in the first place. It's hard to make it into a novel in the second place, an exciting piece of commercial fiction in the third place. So it's a really nasty problem. But on the other hand, there's a lot of young, energetic, thoughtful writers who are also ambitious. So I look for more, and I fully expect that genre. You see, I mean, I've been dismissive of these fine-tuned names, but on the other hand, maybe they're a function of our time because of Amazon.com. Certainly the critic Mark McGurl has made a great case that this is just natural that this happens. It's neither good nor bad. It's natural. When you got 5 million volumes, you have to make distinctions. Mm-hmm. So now we're seeing things like hope punk or solar punk or I don't even know. I mean, I hate the suffix punk so badly that I feel, these names suck.
Yeah.
But the impulse behind the names is fully admirable.
Yeah.
And what they really should say, I'm doing utopian science fiction. What are you going to do to me? And they should plump down for that tradition and say, with pure courage, I'm doing utopian science fiction. It gets them into Guin and Huxley and Robert Graves and William Morris and H.G. Wells and Samuel Butler, and it goes right back to Sir Thomas More or even to Plato, and that's not a bad tradition to evoke. And so then when you say, oh, well, I'm hope punk, as if hope isn't inherent in everything, and as if punk is a good thing to be, well, this is a terrible strategic error. It shows that their analysis is insufficient to the problem at hand, and that's too bad, but, not my problem. I'm a utopian science fiction writer.
I love it. Tony, did you have any big final questions for Stan?
Oh my gosh, I have so many things that I could ask, but I guess the one thing I want to ask that we haven't talked about a whole lot, in part because, like you said, this is going to be about fantasy, which, as you said, is not something you do a whole lot of, but it seems like science fiction generally has been a lot more receptive to thinking about climate change, thinking about terraforming, thinking about these things that are kind of, the solutions and maybe the problems themselves are, due to technology, can be answered by science. Fantasy is kind of like separate from that. And I don't know that I'm framing this as a good question, but can fantasy do something? Are there fantastical ways that we could be exploring climate change and terraforming and these questions that science fiction has traditionally kind of examined?
I have a theory. It'll take me 5 minutes, but you can edit later if you want, or you can cut it out. But I think, so fantasy, say something that Jameson said long ago, fantasy is about pre-capitalist societies and science fiction is about capitalist or post-capitalist societies. It's a rough cut. But fantasy very often has a landscape, as a magical landscape, as a place that is intensely interesting, very often forest or an epic trek across a vast and variegated landscape. Well, this is part of its attraction. The rise of fantasy in the last 20 years is in a mostly urban audience of young people who are spending the majority of their lives inside rooms, looking at screens and being told by adults what to do. And their lives are so constricted and they're so indoors, and they're still primates that are designed by evolution to be outdoors running around for 68 hours every day, and they're not. They're like prisoners. And so modern society, a prison, alas. And you can walk out. This is the great genius of Corey's title, Walk Away. You just walk away from that life, and you can. But if you don't, you're reading fantasy, and so, okay, you're on a horse. Suddenly you know how to ride a horse, this incredible beast. You're in a forest, and it's all green, and trees are speaking to you, and the birds speak to you. And, well, yeah, that happens. And it's so attractive for people stuck in rooms. And then, the other stuff also accrues to it. The bad guys are obviously bad, and you've got a sword. You don't have to sue them. You can go chop their head off. You chop them off at the neck. And suddenly they're done. And not only that, but the villain is not you or what you do. The protagonist is generally good or really trying to be good, and the antagonist is obviously evil. So the simplicities of fantasy are combined also with a chance to get outdoors again. And even though it's a fantasy getting outdoor, or a virtual, or an imaginary, or a fictional getting outdoors, that's part of the attraction, I feel. So there's something green at the heart of fantasy that is part of its attraction. I'm quite convinced of this, having read a bunch of fantasies to my kids when they were young. So this is, I'm 10 years off the cutting edge, but nevertheless, I read a lot of it and studied a lot of it. And there's some great fantasy writers out there. Joan Aiken, oh my God, she was a genius. It goes on like that. Peter Dickinson. I would regard the great fantasy writers as being a little less well-known than, say, Tolkien.
Right.
But in Tolkien, it's obvious as hell that one of the great things about Tolkien is you get to take a long trip across that interesting landscape.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and there are talking trees who literally take action in the plot. Yeah, absolutely. I love that so much.
Yeah, I love that too. And it's a compensatory fantasy. So the stuff you're not getting in your life, you turn to literature to read. Well, including basic excitement, but also the experiences that are really deep in our brains, like looking at fire around in the dark at night, which we hardly ever do anymore, and it would even be bad if everybody got to do it. We don't have too many people, and we don't want to burn that much wood. But we evolved. Our brains are the way they are because of the life that we led for about 1 million years. And so anytime you get even a touch of that, and even if it's a virtual or fictional touch, like in literature, you respond to it like you're a starving person that's being given some food. And then I would encourage everybody, and maybe this is a good thing to end on because I know we're going over, is walk away, go outdoors, forget about the screens. And podcasts are good this way. I've been listening to podcasts while I take a walk, and I'm outdoors, I'm looking at trees, I'm looking at birds, which are the only wildlife that is still everywhere on the planet. I'd like to look at mammals. They're hard to see. So you take a walk, and maybe, it's a little bit too simplistic, or you're not getting enough input, and you're just addicted to your devices and to your information input, and not realizing that the outdoor world is always more input that you ever get on screen. But in any case, you can listen to podcasts while you go for a walk, and it's already a better day for you.
Yeah.
So I recommend doing that.
Man, so if you can't rewild the whole world, you can at least rewild your own life.
Yeah, and I hope we can rewild the whole world too. But for sure, this is the Dalai Lama, this is Cory Doctorow. You can seize your own fate. You can do it yourself and give it a try as an experiment. I spend the first half hour of every day in the morning sitting in my garden pulling weeds. And I cannot tell you how much that adds to my sanity and to my good spirits. We are prisoners of our own device. And so this is really, I have this uncomfortable feeling of being an old hippie talking to new, young techno geeks in a language that they scarcely will believe in. But, I say it anyway because I'm very convinced.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, that's a great final note for today. Stan, where can people find out more about you?
No, I don't have a website. I know that there is a website run by some people that is about my books, and I like those people very much. They're wonderful. But I myself am trying to stay offline on purpose to A, spend more time outdoors myself, but also B, make people get to me through my books, because really, in this last hour, you pretty much heard everything I've got to say. And, my books do the job. I think for Kimon and for the other people involved, there's a kimstanleyrobinson.info. There are a couple of Facebook pages run by other people that are about my books, and so I don't even know what to say about those. I'm not well informed.
I love it.
That said, I certainly do love podcasts.
Tony, where can you find out more about our podcast and other episodes?
So, if you are interested in listening to more of us, we are now available across all the major platforms. We are on iTunes, we are on SoundCloud, we're on Spotify, we're on Stitcher, and our back episodes are all on YouTube. On each of those platforms, just just search the Imaginaries. Maybe the Imaginaries Podcast will take you to us, but you'll find us either way. We also are online at imaginaries.net, and you can follow us on Twitter at imaginary_pod and email us at imaginarypod@gmail.com.
That is a lot of places you can find us. We hope you'll use at least one. And a huge, huge thank you to Kim Stanley Robinson for joining us on this week's episode. You are magnificent, and your books are magnificent, and we can't wait to see what you come up with next.
Yes, thank you.
Well, thank you, Tony and Ken. It's been my pleasure. I appreciate getting the opportunity.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Bye.
3, 2, 1.